So our third and final part of this week's lecture brings us to the gender and Judaism and Christianity. Now, when we talk about the Judeo-Christian Middle East, we are specifically speaking about two of the Abrahamic religions, Christianity that you see on the right, and Judaism. Okay? And then, of course, we'll discuss Islam, for the rest of the semester. But what are the major events that we need to look at? Of course, we're going to be looking at the life of a Jewish woman known as Miriam, otherwise known as Mary today, and another Jewish woman around the same time who happened to share the same name, Miriam of Magdala, or you might know her as Mary Magdalene. Then afterwards, we're going to look at the life of one of the earliest Christian apostles named Thecla. And then we're going to discuss two church fathers, Tertullian and August of Hippo, as well as two church mothers, Melania and Paula. Okay, so let's now look at Judaism. But when we look at kind of the crystallization of Judaism, we have to realize Judaism was also influenced by a lot of culture, motifs, and the religions that surrounded it. Okay? So in other words, the Jews as a people, as they developed their religion, what was one of their key kind of strategies over thousands of years? Was to make themselves or maintain a distinct identity with distinct religious practices that, of course, made them distinct from the other religions and the adherents of those religions that are around them. One of the interesting figures that appears in early Judaism is Lilitu, which in later Hebrew became pronounced as Lilith. Now, Lilith was the female version of the vampire demon. She was beautiful and a promiscuous vampire, okay? Partial to the blood of children, infants, and young men, okay? In other words, Lilith is this kind of, fits the trope of the succubus in Western tradition. And if you don't know what a succubus is, look it up. There, of course, the succubi are stuck in our popular historical imagination as well. There's a whole episode of South Park devoted to a succubus and chef. American Horror Story has an entire episode dealing with quote-unquote witches, but one of them also happens to be a succubus. Okay. So in other words, remember now the Jews during a period known as the Babylonian captivity, of course, would have picked up a lot of culture while they were in exile in Babylon. So a lot of the Mesopotamian legends of Lilitu started to appear in Judaism. Lilith was a vampire, but also portrayed as an owl. In other words, the bird of the night. Now, we've already seen a bas relief of Lilitu, okay, where she is flanked by owls. Remember this, right? Now, remember Lilith and Ishtar more or less kind of form a continuum, if you will, right? Now, think about this. What was Lilith responsible for in ancient Sumerian and then later Judaic traditions? Okay. Because who appears in the night? Owls? And in the form of an owl, of course, Lilith could also be represented in that form. What was Lilith responsible for in the night? for killing babies. Okay, it was associated that what today we probably know as sudden infant death syndrome, in those days was associated with a visitation from Lilith. And what would she do to young men? She would cause them to have nocturnal emissions. Okay. In other words, another form of killing, I guess, future babies. So from this tradition of Lilith visiting the bed at night and killing babies, mothers would sing a song. Now, not only is this a kind of Judaic tradition, it would continue into Europe. And what was that song called? A Lilith bye. In other words, wishing Lilith goodbye. And if you contract that, what do we get? The word the lullaby. That's where it comes from. Okay. So then, where else does Lilith appear? You see, in the Old Testament is basically the Jewish version of the Bible. And in the Jewish version of the Bible, we have Adam and Eve, right? But Adam had another wife before Eve. And who was that wife called? That was Lilith as well. So what do we see kind of over the long term? We have Ishtar, and we see these kind of goddesses. They go by multiple names: Ishtar, then Lilitu, and Lilith. And if anyone who speaks Arabic or Hebrew, what is the word for night? Layla. Okay, and so now you see the continuum. We go from Ishtar to Lilith to the very name Layla, which is just now the Arabic and Hebrew word for night, right? Now, oops, sorry about that. Adam's first wife was Lilith, okay? Now, why was she, what problems did she cause in the Garden of Eden? And here now we get to the patriarchy. Well, she did something that challenged Adam's dominant status. She wanted to have sex on top. No, I'm not going to act that out or do a hand gesture. Yeah, she wanted to have sex on top instead of the missionary position. Okay? And that was considered by Adam a challenge to his masculinity. And what for that crime, how was Lilith punished? She was expelled from the Garden of Eden and turned into what? A vampire demon that often takes the shape of an owl. That's a Jewish tradition. It didn't make it into the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis only tells us about Adam and Eve. Eve, in theory, would have been Adam's second wife. And yes, as a punishment, and see kind of the patriarchy in this, for trying to challenge Adam's dominant status, that was her punishment, turned into this kind of demon-like figure. Now, we see in Judaism, it's not uncommon that you adopt the legends of the cultures that surround you, okay? But whereas this kind of figure would have been revered in the local traditions, it's common then to take some, even though she was fearful, right? Lilith was fearful, but still kind of a demigod, if you will. Okay. You want to take what is sacred in some cultures, and what we see in Judaism, you make it evil in yours, and that's the way you distinguish yourself from surrounding cultures. Lilith, I mean, if you look at this kind of how Lilith is depicted here in our popular historical imagination, I'm not sure why she's always blonde. Okay, in theory, in the Garden of Eden, Lilith, I don't think could have been blonde because that's a genetic mutation that emerges much later. If we're using the book of Genesis as the starting point of humanity, but it also takes here you see kind of comparisons between Lilith and the deity known as Kali in Indian tradition. Okay. But then what happens in the late 1800s? Lilith gets reinvented as kind of a symbol of female empowerment that corresponds with modern feminism and the wave of feminism that emerged around the late 1800s that coincided with the women's movement to vote. Now, do you notice Lilith here is surrounded by the snake? And we have to ask ourselves, how did this snake enter our imagination? What is the relationship between the snake and the Garden of Eden? Let's keep on going. Lilith, for some reason, also takes on kind of satanic notions, or as we see in kind of the birth of the late 1800s, neo kind of interest in the occult, the neo-occult movement. We see Lilith in an image here. But now let's go from Lilith to Adam and Eve. And look at this image here. Never mind the belly buttons. But what is Eve doing in this painting? She is committing the human's first sin by taking an apple from the forbidden tree after giving in to the temptation of a snake. And what is being depicted in this painting? Eve is responsible for original sin, and then humanity being banished from the Garden of Eden. Okay. Let's look at how this event, how is it imagined, and what real life consequences emerge because of this event that is being described in the book of Genesis. So of course, when we're talking about Genesis, again, we're talking about the first book of the Hebrew Bible that would later become the first book of the Christian Old Testament. Look at this imagery here, which of course is also meant to be very phallic, but there's a common misperception in that the snake was an embodiment of Satan. Nowhere in the book of Genesis is there an explicit link between the serpent and Satan. Nowhere is that explicit. It's just over time we associated the serpent with Satan, kind of beguiling Eve and getting her to commit original sin. The serpent, remember now, where did we see the serpent? And remember, where did the Jews live when they were compiling the Old Testament? Well, one place, Babylon, and the other place in Egypt. Now, what did we see in Egypt? In Egypt, the snake was revered as sacred. The snake and Isis were often depicted almost in the same form. So you see during these times of antiquity, it was not unusual to have an animal and a god. Gods being depicted not only as planets, but animals at the same time. The snake was revered in the ancient Middle East. So how do the Jews differentiate themselves from the other religions surrounding them? The snake goes from being a revered animal to becoming something demonic. And now you see this kind of process of differentiation. While other religions revere the snake, we consider it as a source of evil. And indeed, it was the snake that slithers on the ground is no longer revered in the Judaic tradition, but is seen as the animal guilty of having Eve take apples from the forbidden fruit. By the way, which is another mistake. So usually we associate the snake with Satan, right? Think if the ancient Garden of Eden was supposed to be in the Middle East, because of course it's a garden that the Jews would have written about. Do you think there would have been, if any of you have been to the Middle East, do you think there's a lot of apple trees growing there? Think where apples grow today, right? Washington State, usually in the forests. The forbidden fruit would have been most likely a fruit very common to the Middle East around that time, the pomegranate, which is very delicious, but also a fruit that was very much suited for the desert environment. So here in this picture, we have there we go. In other words, this is an example of popular historical memory. The seduction, the temptation of Eve. Now we don't even see the snake. We have the devil incarnate, right? I'm just going to show you an example of how in popular culture now, the apple is a fruit, but also Satan and the snake are conflated, considered the same. Let's go back to original sin. So there you see, again, the snake emerging. Now, what is the consequence of Eve having listened to the snake? From this point onwards, this serves as a justification for that first level of patriarchy, religious patriarchy, because it was a woman that was responsible for original sin. Women should be punished from that point onwards. And I'll just give you an example of real life consequences of this account in Genesis. You know, throughout the Victorian era, when women were giving birth, painkillers had been invented by then. They were deliberately denied to women so that they suffer for the crime of original sin. That is just one example that came to my mind of the kind of consequences of Eve being associated with original sin. Now, the book of Genesis is important to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So we have Genesis in the Torah, Bible, and Quran. That's what makes them Abrahamic religions, right? However, there's one difference in the Quran. It's both Adam and Eve that are equally guilty of taking the fruit from the forbidden tree. Okay. In other words, you don't have this, there's plenty of patriarchy, but you don't have Genesis or justifying the religious patriarchy that emerges afterwards. The interesting thing about the snake, though, was even in early Christianity, the snake wasn't automatically associated with the devil. Okay, but here are just other more examples of how the snake was revered. So think of the Mercury, the symbol of Mercury, or the symbol we use for medicine today usually has a snake. That gives you something about it's how the snake was revered. And still, even in early Christianity. So if you look at this very early Christian coin, you see how you have the snake on the cross. In other words, it was even associated, it wasn't even considered an evil entity until much later when we started. The snake was just a beholder, somebody who possessed what? Knowledge. Okay. Because that's what the snake approached Eve says. Okay. The tree of forbidden fruit, what am I in the Garden of Eden? I possess knowledge to know that that tree is forbidden. And so it's not uncommon to say, okay, what was Jesus in? Jesus was also the possessor of knowledge. But then much later, let's look at the transformation of this Jewish woman. This Jewish woman that we know as Miriam. Okay, so what can we say about Miriam? Well, from the Bible, not much. Okay? There's not much in the Bible that tells us about the life of Mary, except that she was married to Joseph at what age? Well, what does this tell us? A good Jewish practicing woman got married at age 13, engaged at 12, at age 13 to a much older Joseph, okay, as a good Jewish girl or / woman would do at that time. Yeah, keep in mind marriages occurred at much earlier ages in those days because, yeah, life was short. Now, what I have to say as a historian, sure, life was short because a lot of things could kill you, particularly if you were a woman. And that most deadly of killers of women at this time was giving birth to children. If you could get past 30, if you're a female or male, then life was good. Then it was smooth sailing. Okay, if you survived all those disease and hardships, then you could grow to a ripe old age. Now, let's look what's happening. These are Renaissance paintings from the 1700s, okay? So I just told you the life of a Jewish woman named Mary. Now, in this case, look what Mary is standing on. And you'll see in European depictions of Mary, there's always two elements to it. Or I should say Catholic depictions of Mary, because Protestants don't have a tradition of depicting Mary in detail. Mary is always standing on a crescent. Now, what is the crescent? Why is the crescent important? The crescent is a pre-Christian symbol. It's a pre-Christian symbol of fertility. But after a while, as we have kind of the cult of the veneration of Mary emerge in Christianity, and that has a lot to do with gathering the followers of the cult of Isis. Mary, from this point onwards, would always be associated with the crescent. Okay, in fact, that would be her symbol. If you didn't want to draw the Virgin Mary, if you wanted a quick symbol, just as we use the cross as a quick symbol of Christianity, the crescent would be a quick symbol of the Virgin Mary. In paintings and in statues. So for example, I used to teach at a Catholic university in Milan. Every time I entered the door, there was a statue above me of Mary in stone with a crescent standing on a snake. Now think about this. Why is this important? Remember the cult of Isis? How was Isis depicted? As a snake. So what are the Christians saying to the followers of Isis? Okay. Adopt the Virgin Mary, but stop using the image of the snake. You are abandoning the snake, okay, for now this new goddess, the Virgin Mary. And what does the snake have in his mouth? The apple. Now the snake, okay, so in other words, what do we have? The Jews repudiated the snake as the tempter, and now we have in Christian tradition, Mary destroying the evil snake, and by this time taking on the connotations of the devil. Here is one in the Museum Thoralbo. It's a museum in Madrid, a few blocks away from my house in Madrid. Yeah, I used to teach in Spain in Milan. Quite nice life. Okay, what about this Renaissance painting? Where is the crescent? There should be a crescent there, otherwise why did I include it? Where's the snake? Okay, I mean, not every painting had it. Okay, so let's skip this. Why did I include it there? Okay. Here, not the moon, but the full moon. Where's the snake? I just like the babies fighting. I know what it is, these little fat babies fighting. I think that's it. Look at them go, I just cracks me. By the way, what do we call these little babies? Because they don't belong in this lecture. Anyway, those babies are known as cherubim. And they're cute little Cupid-like figures by the time of these very late Renaissance Baroque style artistic movements. But the cherubim in the Bible are not described anything like this. In fact, the Bible doesn't even say angels have wings. Usually angels appear in human form. But maybe it was just these fat babies. Okay, there we go, that's better. So there we see again the Virgin Mary with a crescent. And here we go again. The Virgin Mary, here we have the crescent in the background. And what is she stomping with her feet? The snake bearing an apple. And those are Catholic images. These are Orthodox Christian images. Where here we have, again, Mary always depicted with a crescent. This is the Russian Orthodox Church. So, in other words, the goddess worship didn't end entirely. The reverence for the divine feminine continued with the veneration of Mary. Now, here's an interesting phenomena, as we're going to study in the next lecture. The reverence for the Virgin Mary is very dominant in Christianity. And you're going to see it's even more pronounced in Islam. So some of you might be surprised about this, and we'll discuss the veneration of Mary in the Islamic tradition. But Mary, or the name Miriam, is just as common in the Muslim world as it is in the Christian world. Now, let's look at the crescent. When the city of Rome fell in the 400, there was another city that called itself the Second Rome. That Second Rome was Constantinople, which we'll refer to a bit later. And Constantinople, of course, later Christianity would be adopted as the religion of the Roman Empire. Thus, Constantinople really became the capital of the Christian world, well before Rome did. What was the flag of Constantinople? Well, the flag was of the Virgin Mary. Not the Virgin Mary as the woman, but the crescent. The star and crescent became the symbol for the Virgin Mary. Look at the Virgin Mary here. The halo was now represented with the star and the crescent, and that became the flag of Constantinople. And it was the flag of Constantinople until the year 1453. What happened in that year? The Muslims conquered the cities. The Ottoman Empire conquered the city. And what did they do? Now, at that time, the city was still known as the Second Rome. Okay. The conqueror of Constantinople called himself the conqueror of Rome. In fact, he chose the name Caesari, which is just the word for Caesar. And what did he do with the conquered flag? He made it his own. And why is that? Well, because also Muslims venerate the Virgin Mary. So not only did he take the flag from the vanquished, but from that point onward, the flag went from the flag of Christian Constantinople to the Muslim Ottoman Empire, which went on to conquer most of Europe, the heart of Asia, and all of North Africa. From that point onwards, the flag became associated with the Ottoman Empire and Islam. And that's why when usually you see a reference to Islam, you see the Star and Crescent. But what does the Star and Crescent stand for? It stands for the Virgin Mary. In other words, who would have guessed a Jewish woman would later become an example of the divine feminine in Christianity and Islam to this very day? Do you notice, as a good Jewish woman, what did Mary also always wore? Because the minute she went from the property of Zechariah to her husband Joseph, she always wore the veil. Okay. And of course, yes, this is why you always see the Virgin Mary, not in all Renaissance painting, but usually you see her veiled, as she would be wearing as a practicing Jewish woman. Now, the other Mary we have to talk about is Mary Magdalene. Sorry, I just put in my battery. Now, when you think of Mary Magdalene, usually because, again, of popular historical memory, we think of Mary Magdalene as the prostitute that Jesus brought into the early Jesus movement. Again, this is another mistake from the Bible. Okay. The name Mary was so common, it's like, I don't know, I'm not sure if you had this in your class. In every class I had growing up, there was always two Jennifers, right? It was just such a common name. So many Jennifers, right? Mary was like that in Jewish culture. It was a very common name. In the Bible, there is a reference to a prostitute, which Jesus treats with humanity. And a couple of lines later, we have a reference for the first time to Mary of Magdala. Because the prostitute and Mary are so close together, it was, from this point onwards, Mary Magdalene was always associated with the prostitute mentioned earlier. Mary Magdalene, though, there's a good reason, and I can tell you already just from her name why she wouldn't have been a prostitute. Because she's referred to with a last name. And I'll tell you that usually prostitutes in antiquity were, like I said, were not allowed to wear the veil. Usually they weren't having some kind of identifier or last name. Now, usually what we call last names back then was just really the tradition of Mary from somewhere, right? Think of Jesus. How do we refer to them? Jesus of Nazareth. Mary of Magdala, okay? Even my name, that's the old Middle Eastern tradition. I come from a town called Al-Marashi, right? The fact that Mary is given an origin name, or what today we call a last name, indicates that she's most likely not a prostitute. Not only that, what was Magdala? What was that town? That was a very prosperous fishing town. Now, keep in mind in the Bible, there are 4 Gospels. Those weren't the only Gospels that were written. So what do we have in the Bible? In the New Testament, that is, sorry. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. How many other gospels were there? About 50, 50, 50, that were not included into what we call the canonical gospel. In other words, go back to the city of Constantinople, and a decision was made there that all these gospels have to be checked for their veracity, and the ones that the bishops who convened thought worthy of being included into a single volume became the birth of the gospels that we know of. In other words, the Bible is not the only source that gives us the history of Christianity. Now, having said that, Mary of Magdalene, if you look at the other sources, what do they tell us? That she most likely inherited the fortune from her wealthy husband who was a fish trader. Magdala was a prominent fishing town. Okay. So what else can we construct from Mary Magdalene's life? Not only was she wealthy, she was the one who financed Jesus and his followers. In other words, for Jesus to, travel and preach, of course, he needed lodging, he needed food, and that would have been provided by Mary Magdalene. Okay. Not only is Mary Magdalene playing a prominent role in financing the Jesus movement, there is an entire gospel. And what is the word gospel by the mean? What does it mean? Gospel is just a construction of the German Gottspiel, or the good word, the good speech, if you will. Okay. There's a gospel of the other apostles. There's a gospel of Thomas. There's a gospel of Philip. There's a gospel of Mary Magdalene. Now, what does the Gospel of Mary Magdalene tell us? It tells us that Jesus had a special relationship to her. Okay. What does Peter the Rock, as he was called? His full name is Simon Peter. Peter is the old, I think that's the Latin word, yeah. Lith is the Greek word for rock. So Petra is the Latin word. Peter is jealous of Mary because Jesus shared information with Mary. Then look at what Mary says. What did I learn from Jesus? If you look at sentence number 2, this is almost kind of a Buddhist, spiritual, mystical approach to the world. The world is transient. The world is ephemeral. Now, the minute she starts talking into this language, this is not just the gospel. This enters the realm of what are called the Gnostic Gospels. The various Gospels I mentioned, the Gospel of Thomas, for example, now the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. These were Gospels that did not make it into the Bible. Okay? And then after the official New Testament was compiled, these Gospels were forbidden. They were called the Apocryphal Gospels, and that's where the word apocryphal comes from. And they were ordered to be destroyed. In other words, and how do we know about these Gospels? It wasn't until the 1950s during an archaeological dig. Not the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea Scrolls or something else. But this isn't during it. Actually, it wasn't even archaeology. It was a complete accident. Ancient scrolls were found in a cave complex in Egypt. Okay? In other words, back then, there would have been some people who couldn't bear to destroy the Gospels. Rather than burn them, they just hid them in a cave. And what was discovered? Well, this was the beginning of the discovery of a lot of Gospels that were not included in the Bible, including Gospels like this. Okay? Gnostic Gospels, they were Gospels that talked about the spirituality of Christianity that was internal. It was more a mystical approach to Christianity. And of course, for a new church that was developing in the 300s, okay, any kind of Gospels that basically didn't really necessitate an organized religion were destroyed. The Gospel of Mary on 2 counts. Not only does it talk in kind of a Gnostic spiritual approach to Christianity, but it's the gospel of a very prominent woman at a time when the church was becoming very male-centered. So what happened as a result? Just like we make the mistakes about the Bible of the snake and Satan, the apple, So too, it was over time mistaken that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute, and that was a mistake that often the church encouraged. Now, notice I'm saying the word the church because there's no Catholic or Orthodox church at this time. They're more or less the same. They haven't split yet. When do they split? About around, let's say, the 1050s. That's when they begin to split. Okay, so now what happens? The church didn't want Mary Magdalene to have a powerful role in the Bible because by this time the church becomes very much patriarchal. Okay, think of the word patriarchal. The highest position in the Greek Orthodox Church is known as the patriarch. The word we use for the Bible, for the Pope. The Pope, his name is just basically the patriarch in Latin, the Papa, right? Now, the church, or I should say the Catholic Church, finally corrected this mistake. How long did it correct this mistake? Not until the 1960s did the Pope issue an edict saying, for the longest time, we've allowed this myth to persist, okay? And the myth still persists. Mary Magdalene as a prostitute still carries on to this very day. Okay. So do you see here in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, right? Jesus loved her more than us. Now here we start entering a bit of dangerous territory. Because based on this gospel, now we're going into Dan Brown territory. We're going into Da Vinci Code territory. Because here begins the myth that Mary Magdalene was Jesus's wife, okay? And we have no evidence for this, okay? And we're not even sure here now, the word love has multiple meanings, okay? It could be love in the Platonic sense, in kind of a religious sense, and after all, Jesus said he loved his apostles and so on and so forth. But from this point onwards, if you look at sentence 2, here becomes the beginning of the myth of, well, it's a myth because it can't be proven. That's what I mean, that Mary Magdalene and Jesus were married. Now, would have that been possible? Well, now here we get into the tricky part of history versus faith. Jesus was a rabbi. He was called rabbi. And was it common for rabbis to marry? Yes. Okay. Does that mean he married Mary Magdalene? Of course, there's no proof. Does that mean he had children, as Dan Brown says? A good Jewish rabbi would. Okay. But nevertheless, Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, never married or had children at the same time. That's the history. And of course, then we get into the complicated matter of faith, but let's just focus on the history from this point. And here we have an example, Mary Magdalene repentant, or in other words, Mary Magdalene depicted by Gustave Doré in the late 1800s, the repentant whore. That's how she was referred to. I'm not using the word whore. How she's referred to in popular historical culture. Now, these are the women the Jewish women in Jesus's lifetime. Now, when we could talk about the first prominent Christian woman. Now, when I talk about the first prominent Christian woman, by definition, she would have to be a follower of Paul. Okay? Because it's under Paul that now he starts to make a distinction between Jews who follow Jesus and finally followers of Jesus who cannot be reconciled with Judaism and are part of a new movement called Christianity. Paul's female companion, now when I just say companion, just follower, okay, not in any kind of romantic sense, was a woman named Thecla. Now Thecla begged to be baptized by Paul, and Paul refused. Paul refused, saying, you are not ready, you are not worthy of being baptized. Thecla, I would argue, is one of the first most prominent Christian women. Thecla was eventually punished for not accepting the hand of a prominent Roman figure and was put to be killed in the Colosseum. Now, we're not talking about Rome. Remember, Anatolia. So in other words, what would Thecla have been? She would have been a Middle Eastern woman by default, right? We're talking about Anatolia and what is today Turkey. So she was sent to the Colosseum to be punished. Because why wouldn't she marry this prominent Roman man? He wasn't Christian. Now, what happens? Of course, like anyone, any Christian martyr who was to be consumed by the lions, what happened? The lions in this case were also women. And recognizing, so these she lions, recognizing Thecla's divine presence instead of devouring her. And every saint has to have a miracle. Instead of devouring her, protected her. Okay, and that's why you see these lions around Thecla right now. They felt an affinity to her. Do you see, this is a very gendered, female power story that doesn't make it into the Bible, right? Anyway, so of course the Roman authorities are furious and the lions wanted to kill her. So what did they do? Now again, I'm not sure how much of this is really history or how much of this is legend, but it goes to show you of a very kind of a female version of Christianity that was written out of the church history. They set up a pool in the Colosseum where she is to be devoured by sharks or eels, some kind of these nasty animals, most likely eels. I don't know where I got sharks from. Eels were used to consume as a form of punishment, flesh-devouring eels. Okay. So she was supposed to be pushed into this pool, but then what happens, and this is the second miracle, a bolt of lightning comes from the sky, hits the pool, and electrocutes all the eels and kills them. I guess they weren't electric eels. And that's the second miracle. And then what does Thecla do to Paul, who was watching her getting killed and does nothing? She says, Paul, you refuse to baptize me, so I'm going to baptize myself in this pool of now dead eels. Okay. Isn't that a story of a powerful, empowered Christian woman? She is known as Saint Thecla, but the trials of Saint Thecla are rarely taught in church sermons and are rarely taught as kind of official church history. And why is that? Well, because Christianity was really a religion established by Paul. And think of how the New Testament, so many of these are letters of Paul. And then the church fathers. And who are the church fathers? Well, Tertullian. This is his opinion of women, okay? Very much influenced by the story of Genesis, or the book of Genesis. Look at St. Augustine of Hippo. Again, another Middle Eastern very prominent Christian figure. We know him from his book of Confessions. Okay. Again, and well, we can say the church fathers were patriarchs to the core. But nevertheless, there were also church mothers. And who are they? They go by the name of Melanie and Paula. And what did they set up in ancient Roman society? They set up the first, what we could call churches in Rome. So in other words, what did they do? They inherited a lot of wealth. Not only did they set up the first churches, but they set up the first desert communities in Egypt, the first monasteries. In other words, this idea to be a good Christian, you have to withdraw from city life, move to the countryside to contemplate divinity. The whole practice of monasteries we owe to Paula and Melania. And how is Thecla commemorated today? There are churches known as the Saint Thecla Monastery in Ma'lula, in what is today Syria. Okay. Now, just so you know something about this monastery, this is a monastery where they still speak Aramaic. That's the language Jesus would have spoken. The Bible would have been written in Greek. But Saint Thecla, this is a monastery. Now, I'll give you something away in terms of my religious background. On one side, I'm Muslim, and on the other side, I'm Syriac Orthodox Christian. So who are the Syriac Orthodox Christians? Well, they are a Middle Eastern Christian community that not only sets up monasteries like this. The Syriacs were the first group. Well, like I said, Paul was part of a Christian movement, but who was the first group of people who said we're no longer Jewish followers of Jesus? They were the Syriacs, okay? The Syriacs were the first community that said in the year, I think around 40 or 50, we are today, as of now, Christians, and the first building we construct will be now a church, not a temple. And of course, to this very day, they exist. They speak Aramaic. In other words, I have relatives who still speak the language of Jesus. Of course, it's evolved. It's been 2,000 years. And St. Thekla's monastery, Matlula, could have been destroyed by ISIS had they proceeded a bit further. Okay. And then basically what we end our lecture on, what happened to the Roman Empire? Well, it's split into two, the Western and Eastern half. The Western half fell to two Germanic tribes known as the Goths. And the Eastern half became no longer Latin speaking, but Greek speaking and thinking. And it was a very patriarchal society where I want you to think basically what is all that's left of the Byzantine Empire, as we call the Eastern Roman Empire? Well, Greek culture. And think about that when you look at the old women. You could watch this on your own, but look at the old Greek women. Notice how they all wear the veil. And notice how these old Greek women communicate what we can call Greek patriarchy. And you can watch those on your own. Some of the videos might be, the links might be broken, but I think most of them are still there. And that concludes our lecture on how patriarchy was created in the ancient Middle East. And that bas relief that you see on the cover of Lerner's book, that comes from Samaria. So next week, we'll discuss now the birth of Islam and its relationship with gender.